Hello and welcome to the next week on Developing Faith with Hebrews. We have made it to Hebrews 13, which is the final chapter, and we're just going to spend this week and next week just covering this final chapter of Hebrews together. I hope you've been encouraged by this book. I know I have, and challenged as well. So let's just see what the writer has got to say to us in this final chapter. So today we're looking at Hebrews 13 verses 1 to 19. So I'd encourage you, go and have a read. I'm not going to read it all because there's quite a lot. In my version, in the NIV, it's called Concluding Exhortations. And this kind of how I describe this part of it is it's almost a bit like a list of things to remember to do in living out your faith, living out your life for Jesus. And it just feels like the writer, after everything they've unpacked over the previous 12 chapters of kind of theology and understanding and everything, that now they've got to this point where they're saying, okay, so you know all this, you understand this, I've given you reasons for living a life of faith. So now here in this one chapter is a load of practical things that are part of living out this life of faith. You've got the understanding, you've got the theological explanation, you've got the case for faith in Jesus. Now in response, let's go and let's do it, is how I see this chapter. So some of the things that the writer covers, hopefully you have read it, you've paused and you've read it before you've listened to me, but just to highlight some of the things they cover, and then I'm going to go into a bit more detail on just a couple of them at the end of this video. So a couple of things: keep on loving one another, brilliant. Show hospitality, because you never know the impact that will have on someone, and sometimes you don't even know who the recipient of your hospitality might be and what that might do for their life, to encourage them, whether that's in faith or in other ways. So keep showing hospitality. Remember and support those who are suffering, and it gives examples here of people in prison or people that have been ill-treated. Let's support, let's remember those who are suffering, to honour marriage, to be faithful, to be sexually pure, to keep our lives free from the love of money, to be content with what we have. And it gives a reason for us to be content. It says, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. What a reason for us to have contentment, because God will never leave us or forsake us. Also, the writer says about submitting to leaders, helping them in the job that God has called them to do, in being a benefit to you, to one another. And that will help their work in being a joy, and for us to know that leaders will be held account by God for all that they've done, to be good and share with others. And we are urged to pray. Just a few things there, and as I've said, there's so much there already. We could spend weeks really unpacking each of those points to really get to the bottom of what the writer's meaning by them. But just a few things that I really wanted to give just a little bit more time on, that the writer also mentions in this section of living our lives in faith for Jesus. In verse 7, the writer talks on this idea of remembering our leaders and imitating them. And I think sometimes we can take that a little bit out of the context of what the writer's saying here and miss a couple of key words in this verse that I think gives this even more meaning of what the writer is calling us to do. What the writer says is, in my version, in the NIV, consider the outcome of their, as in the leaders, way of life, and imitate their faith. So the writer's saying to us, don't just look at a leader that you admire, that you look up to, and just copy them and do what they do. What the writer's saying is, look at where their life is headed. What is the outcome of their life? What are they living for? What is the faith that they are showing That's what we need to be looking at. That's what we need to be looking to imitate, their faith, not how they live. Sometimes I think we can look at leaders and teachers that really inspire and encourage us, and that is great. There is nothing wrong with that, or looking up to someone and thinking, that's how I want to live because of my faith in Jesus. But what the writer is saying is we need to imitate their faith in Jesus, not their life. We're all called to live in different ways in one sense, because our lives will look different because of who our family is, what our circumstances are, where we live, what we do in terms of jobs and the lifestyle that we're living out. It will all look different. So we can't just copy someone else's life. What we can do is look to their faith and what their life is pointing towards, if it's pointing towards Jesus, and imitate that faith in our own lives. I hope that makes sense. I hope that has helped maybe unpack that a little bit more. Are we looking at imitating the faith of those whose lives point towards Jesus? Is a really key point within that. And then the writer also encourages us to think about the teaching we're taking on board. In today's world, we can find any kind of teaching to fit with something we want to justify, something we want to believe in. It doesn't necessarily mean that fits with Jesus's teaching or God's truth for us. We have more videos, more podcasts, more information at our fingertips than ever before. And what the writer's encouraging us here on is to be wise. We can listen to anything, we can take on board anything, but are we taking on board what is giving us God's grace, God's truth, filling us with love, with God's love, pointing us towards Him? Or are we listening to and taking on board teaching that points us in another direction, that isn't good for us, that isn't pointing us towards Jesus's grace and love? Let's be wise. And please hear me on all of this that I'm saying today. I'm saying this to myself as well. Let's be wise in the both, as I've just said back in verse 7, where it talked on that idea of leaders and who we imitate and the faith and people we look up to in that way, but also to be wise in the teaching we're taking on board and listening to. And then in verses 11 to 14, the writer talks again on this idea of sacrifices and how the Jews made a sacrifice, but actually Jesus gave himself as a sacrifice for us all. And in this, there's a lot of imagery in terms of the city and Jesus sacrificing himself outside of the city, not within the city. And I think one interpretation and put my teeth in and unpacking of this bit is the idea that the writer again is encouraging the readers and the hearers to not go back to their old ways, to not go back to the old way of sacrifice, but instead to remember Jesus made the sacrifice for all time. That's who we're living for. Not to go back to the way the world might tell us for in our context, kind of translating that into the where and how we're living, is to not live under what the world tells us we need to do and sacrifice and potentially be servants to, but recognize that we are servants of Jesus. Yes, it says there are good sacrifices we can make, and the writer lists that good sacrifices are praise and worship to God, to see how we can do good for others, to share with others, to love others. They're good sacrifices we should all be making. But let's not go back to old ways. Let's not listen to what the world tells us we need to be sacrificing, but looking to what Jesus tells us to do on that. Finally, I wanted us to end today's focusing on verse 6 and the words said there, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? I think that's an incredible perspective the writer's giving us. Who and what are we living for? Who and what makes us afraid? Let's keep looking to Jesus, knowing that He is our helper, He is our hope. He will never leave us or forsake us, as this chapter tells us as well. Let's keep reminding ourselves of that. Whatever the world throws at us, whatever we might have to suffer or endure in terms of hardship, the Lord will never leave us. An incredible reminder. Let's keep holding on to that truth today and every day, as the writer says, knowing we can have confidence in Him. God bless.